Hi, Contessas. Thank you so much for the amazing feedback on my recent solo episode announcing my new career change. For those of you that are new, the TLDR for anyone that didn't hear is that I recently started a new full-time job at Atlassian working in content marketing. Don't worry, this weekly podcast is staying put, so you don't have to worry about any of that. But after the episode, I got lots of questions about my job search. And I know job searching in 2024 feels like just like the Wild West. And questions like about the job search, how I knew it was time for a pivot, and so much more. So I knew that I needed to make an episode to dive into all the details. And I wanted to put myself in the interviewee hot seat. So I invited back Career Contessa coach and podcast regular. You guys have heard her on the show many times, Marnie Lemonik, to be our host. So hi, Marnie, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me back. I'm really excited to switch seats a little bit and learn more about your job search.
I'm really excited too, and I love that you are going to be taking over. So without further ado, I will sit back and be the interviewee.
Yes, you get to relax a little bit
Yeah.
this time. Awesome. Well, I'd love
Exactly.
to start by talking about how you just started this process overall and wrapped your head around what you wanted your next step to be, especially because you had been out of the job market for 10 years. I think a lot of people relate to knowing that they want to make a change, but not sure what they actually want to work towards or what they want to pivot to. So can you break down how you started to tackle that sometimes daunting task?
It was very daunting. And I think the irony is people think because I was in the career space and I was a recruiter before, all of this should be easier. And I can just tell you it's hard for everybody. It was really challenging for me. And I also dealt with a lot of imposter syndrome of like, what have I done the last 10 years? I've done nothing, but I've done everything. And like kind of that like pendulum swing of your emotions. The other thing that was really interesting, and maybe people can relate to this, is I knew very quickly kind of a lot of the things I didn't want to do. So sometimes if you're struggling, that is helpful to start a list of what you don't want to do. And then I really struggled to figure out what I did want to do. So the obvious thing is that people have been surprised about is that I didn't go back to recruiting or HR or a people team. I could have, what was interesting is it was on sort of the like tier 2 list if like tier 1 wasn't going well in the job search, but tier 1 ended up, I narrowed it down to talent brand, something in content. I wasn't totally sure of the job title, but something related to content. Because I was thinking about what are the things that I do at Career Contessa a lot, and like not just okay, what's the task on my to-do list, but then how does that translate to the real world? Like, what does a job description call this thing? So I was trying a lot of, I feel like the job search in the beginning for me was just trying to put language to some of the things I do. So I think I took a step back and I was like, okay, what are the things I don't want to do? Okay, there's that list. Maybe what are the tier 2 things I know I could do, but I don't really, if I can avoid it, I would rather not go back to being a recruiter or an HR person. I've been feeling a little burnt out with that part, maybe career wise. So I was like, and also I haven't been a recruiter for 10 years. So again, my experience, I felt like wasn't that great to find a job and that kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, what are the skills I've been using today that I really enjoy? And now what are those called in the real world? And so I narrowed it down to talent brand, learning and development, and then something related to content. Content is kind of this huge umbrella term. So I tried not to, get crazy with needing to get really specific. But the way I narrow those down are these are things that I'm good at, and these are things that I enjoy, and these are things that have relevant experience. So on my resume, I can narrow in on those things and I can talk about them in like today's terms and not like say, oh, well, when I was a recruiter 10 years ago, this is what I was doing. So that's how I narrowed in on it. I also feel like as far as the time frame, it did not happen overnight. It took like lots and lots of conversations with friends, with family, people in your inner circle of just sort of thinking like, what is it that I do here? What do I like? And so I always want to point that out to people because I think they're like, oh, I'll think about it this weekend and I'll have an answer. That was not my experience either, as someone who I think thinks about this on a regular basis and gets to talk to so many smart people who also like research this topic. So that was it for me. It was the overlap of what am I good at? What do I have experience in? And also like, what is something that someone will pay me for? Like jobs in this area actually exist. And that's how I narrowed it down to those 3 buckets: talent brand, content, learning, development. And I was kind of like, okay, I've got my like pie of the types of jobs I want to look for, and could focus in on sort of more of those job titles, which I think really helps. Like I'm one of those people, once I sort of know what I'm looking for, I'm so much better than when I'm just like floating out to sea, wandering, trying to hope that it comes and finds me.
Yeah, and I love that you had those pieces of the pie, but then you were being a little bit flexible in terms of what you were looking for. You said you wanted something in content, which is pretty broad. And I feel like that's what I tell people in the early stages is it will be exploratory. So you don't have to go into the job search knowing I definitely want this title. It has to be at one of these 20 companies. It's okay to be a little bit open when you still have the structure of knowing the gist of what you want to do. I feel like you found that perfect balance, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think there's so many different ways depending on, like, are you entering the job market for the first time? Are you coming back after, a really long career break? For me, people have to understand I had done basically 10 years in the job market, 10 years as an entrepreneur, and now it was sort of like, okay, I'm trying to combine all those into this new world. And so for me, it was easier to start with sort of like, what is it that I want to do versus where do I want to do it? Although that ended up being another big part of my job search strategy. Like once I was able to narrow it down as to, and I'm sure we're about to get to that question maybe, but once I was able to narrow down just sort of like areas and kind of job functions, then I got really focused on where to do it. And so I don't know if you have to do it in that order or you can flip the order, whatever is helpful for you. But there are a lot of people out there who, and I mention this because there's a lot of people out there who are like, figuring out what I want to do is the hardest part. So, okay, take the pressure off, flip it, figure out where you want to work, and then think like work your way backwards into, okay, what type of jobs does that company hire? What departments do they have? So I only mention that because that was my experience and it was really hard. I'm happy I started sort of with the hard part first, I guess. But if you need it to go the other way where you do company first, that's okay too.
I think it's so nice for people to hear that because I think there's this misconception that there's a right way to do it, or you have to start with the title or start with the company. And I think everything you're saying is just going to give everyone some peace of mind, hopefully, in terms of there is no one right way to execute it.
Oh my gosh, no. And I will tell you, and again, I'm sure we'll get into this further. I was doing a lot of things that I thought were like, quote, the right things to the right way to doing it. And like maybe they helped, but they like, did they matter? Did they not matter? Like, who knows? And so I get frustrated when people, especially I feel like everyone's trying to sell you this one right way to do a resume, to do a job search. And ultimately, I think you have to try a lot of different things, but most importantly, I think you have to be very, very open and truly this is where that fixed mindset versus growth mindset, like we are going to watch and see who has it based on who's flexible, who thinks about job searching like a strategy, like creative problem solving. So yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah, let's get a little bit into the nitty gritty because I know you're very big on tactical tips. And I think this is a section where we might get into some of those. Career Contessa has this awesome job tracker. We'll link it in the show notes. That's on Notion. And in there, there's a company list and a tracker for basically looking at each stage of every application that you submit, all these great things. Can you walk us through any of those tools that you used or other things like goal setting when you started to figure out, okay, how am I actually going to execute this?
Yeah, I absolutely use the job search tracker that we created, the dashboard. So highly, highly recommend it. And what that meant is I was tracking every job application I sent. I was tracking every correspondence I sent and who I sent it to so I could follow up with them. And basically the job search dashboard became sort of like, it was just up on my computer all the time. And I was always checking in on it. Like, are there any to-dos I need to do? It also was really motivating if I felt like, wow, you've taken a break from your job search for a while. And maybe I should back up when people are like, well, how did you decide that you were going to job search? That in and of itself took me a very long time. Career Contessa had hit its 10-year mark. I'd had 2 kids. I was at this like pivotal life moment and I was thinking about, the next 10. And I think this is just like very common, you're like last 10, next 10, that kind of thing. I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about Career Contessa is in an industry that sort of overlaps between like a media industry and an online education industry. And to be very frank, like the algorithms have been changing so much. It's been extremely challenging to maintain quality of content when everybody wants more. The advertisers want more. The networks that you're part of want more. The ad networks. And so I was kind of struggling with this, like, we want to keep the quality of Career Contessa, but we don't have big enough numbers to continue to maybe allow this to be like a full-time gig and all those kind of things. So it was like this perfect storm of like the business model of Career Contessa was changing to no fault of our own. But also I personally was having a thought of like, what do I want to do for the next 10? So I bring this up because I think there's multiple stages. The first stage is just sort of deciding like, are you going to look for a new job? Like, are you committing to this? So I did commit to it partially because I wanted to, and partially because my hands were getting tied a little bit. And then the other part of the process is like, kind of backing up to the last question you just asked me, is like, then, okay, now I'm going to job search. What's going to be my strategy? What do I want to do? Right. Okay. So just setting that context. So now I'm at the place where I've decided I'm job searching. I've decided these are kind of the three areas that I probably have the best shot at not only finding a job, but also being fulfilled. And then the next thing I did in the job search dashboard too, is I started with a list of target companies. Anyone who's taken my online courses or heard me talk about job search strategy, I'm a huge fan of target companies. And, it's interesting because I basically had to take my advice and relearn it step by step because I was like feeling a little overwhelmed. I think that happens in a job search. So if you ever get overwhelmed, like go back to the basics. So I started thinking about what are my must haves and my deal breakers and my nice to haves in the next job. And they were things like, I really wanted to work at a remote company. Like that was really important to me as someone who has two young kids, that work-life balance was really important. I ideally really like this was a nice to have, and I ended up getting it. And I'm so thrilled. I really wanted to report to someone who was a parent, because I really feel like it's very hard to be a working parent and then work for someone who doesn't understand. That was a nice to have. That wasn't like if I had interviewed for my quote dream job and hadn't found it, it would have been okay. I also really wanted to work for a larger company. I feel like Hulu was my startup, then I was an entrepreneur. So I felt like, okay, I really have checked this startup box. I really want to do something that's a little bit more enterprise oriented. And then also I had been in consumer businesses for so long. So these are like all the things you can think about, like industries, job functions, how big of a team. You can think about all those details, and I do think it's helpful. You're not always going to be able to control over all of that. I mean, sometimes the big ones are like, what, I did the math, like what is my salary bottom line that I have to make? So anyway, you get through those logistics, and then I use the dashboard to kind of think about, okay, what are my target companies? The other thing I started doing when I was thinking about target companies and companies that were kind of matching this criteria is also thinking about who do I know in my network. So I was writing down people who worked at like LinkedIn, people that worked at Dropbox, Pinterest, Asana, Atlassian. These were all companies that were remote only or remote first or offered fully remote roles. And then also they were companies where I knew somebody. And so I was like, okay, can I get some warm networking going with those? So I started with those two lists. I also started my job search with trying to have informational interviews or taking the people who were on that networking list and like just re-engaging them in conversations and letting them know like I'm starting my job search. If there's anyone else for me to like start networking, here's my resume, keep me in mind. So I was trying to reestablish like a warm connection with these people, and not necessarily be like, oh, there's a job that opened at your company, can you refer me to it? So I feel like I was trying to do this more proactive approach of like, and the irony of this is like, I did know someone at Atlassian, but I ended up not using them for their referral. So how I got the job. So this is what I was going back to is like, you can sometimes do everything right and it doesn't matter in the end, but I would still recommend doing it because those conversations I had with those networking people to kind of let them know I'm thinking about something new, they were really helpful. I think especially when you are wondering if you are making the right move. You're kind of, I think job searches naturally come with a lot of imposter syndrome. So going back to the tactical things, use the job search dashboard to track all of that information, because having it all visually where you can see it, not just locked in your brain where you're trying to remember it all, is really, really helpful. And then going back to like when I did find jobs that were available, I always applied to them directly through the company website. I never hit easy apply on LinkedIn or anything like that, although that does work for some people. So I don't want to say never, but this was just my process. I applied online. I always tried to find a real person to send an email to. Sometimes I couldn't find them, so I would send my best guess and I would try to send them an in-mail. and I would send them an email directly with my resume attached. And I tracked all of this in the dashboard. And then when I actually got an interview, I actually used our chat GPT prompt to help me come up with just some like basic interview prep questions. And I remember I spent like a couple afternoons like writing out my answers. So truly between our interview prep flashcards and chat GPT, and a friend who was an ex-recruiter who was kind enough to do a mock interview with me, I did like, that's how I did my interview prep, all tracked in the dashboard. Um, Applications was all tracked in the dashboard. Versions of my resume, I mean, I used the Career Contessa resume template to work on that. And the other thing about that is like I didn't put my entire experience in there. I took out a lot of stuff and I just focused in on those three areas. And the other thing that I found really helpful is I used, so for example, if I wanted to be work in talent brand, another name for it is employer brand. And then I would go and I would find as many job descriptions as I could of employer brand or talent brand and help me figure out and or use ChatGPT and throw them all into ChatGPT and be like, what are the key qualifications that you or the essential qualifications and experience you should be highlighting on your resume? And between 5 or 6 different job descriptions, I would come up with a summary, and that's how I would tailor my resume. So I had 3 versions of my resume. Hopefully I'm not just rambling. I'm trying to get as much information out there as possible.
No, this is all gold. Obviously, you are the queen of this. And I think the different versions of resumes is a really good call out that people don't tend to think about. Because I notice when I work with clients, they either have one version that they never change, even if they're applying to a lot of different types of roles, or they want to change it every single time they apply for a job, which time and bandwidth wise is just making it harder than it needs to be. So I think that's so smart to say you want a different version for each role type that you're applying for. So you can make it customized, but still easy on yourself. That's a great tip.
Yeah, and it was almost like having 3 master resumes of those, one that was geared toward highlighting my learning and development experience a little bit more, one toward my content experience, and one more toward my, employer brand experience. And also when I wasn't, the other thing I was doing, I was trying to have informational interviews with people who worked in those roles because I hadn't actually worked in an employer brand before. I hadn't actually worked in content marketing before. So when I wasn't applying for jobs or like reestablishing warm connections with my network, I was sending lots of cold connections to people on LinkedIn, trying to have informational interviews. I will say it is no different trying to get an informational interview today than it was 10 years ago. It's still really hard when it's a cold connection. Hence why the warm connections are so, so valuable. Hence why it's so important to think of your network as something that you should always be like paying attention to and putting energy and effort into, because it's just so hard. And I feel like it's really hard in 2024. And I'm really grateful to the people who were willing to have the informational interviews with me. Some people were willing to only answer questions on LinkedIn. It's kind of like take what you can get. But I guess I want to share that with people. Like, don't be afraid for your networking strategy to be old peers, new peers, cold connections, like connections of connections. I sometimes couldn't get an intro to somebody, but I could say, oh, we're both connected to this person on LinkedIn, or we both worked at this company at the same time, or not at the same time. But like whatever commonality I could find to just try to get the person to read my message, I could. But I also want to be really frank. Like I got a lot of like no's. I got a lot of rejections. I got a lot of just like plain ignores too, like just nothing.
Yeah, I want to dive into that for a second because I think rejection is the thing that is really hard for everyone to take when they haven't been on the job search in a while. And I see this a lot with top performers when it comes to coaching. And I mean, if anyone is more connected than you in the career world, I don't personally know them. So the fact that you had people saying no to you and you were also getting rejected, can you talk about how you dealt with that emotionally or just how you pushed forward?
Yeah, call your mom. No. I mean, like, no, I think one of the best things you can do is find another friend or someone in your inner circle who is going through a job search or a job search buddy of some sort. Um, I think there's nothing worse than feeling kind of alone. And I'm telling you, the rejections always come on the same day within an hour of each other on like a Friday as you're going to into your afternoon. Like it's just really funny because you're always like, oh, okay, and I'm the worst person in the world, and this person doesn't want to hire me. Like it's like, nothing is worse. So I will say I didn't deal with it very well. I was feeling really like ashamed and like wondering if this was the right move and like kind of embarrassed. Like, what have I been doing the last 10 years if people want you? Like all the negative thoughts, like everything you can think of. And I think that's really normal. So I think in hindsight, I wish I had, I feel like I overly prepared on the strategy and I under prepared on the mental stuff of like, okay, what am I going to say to myself when I get rejected? Okay, how am I going to respond when I'm having a tough moment? Things like that. I just didn't prepare very well. So I got also lucky in the sense that I had a friend who was also job searching. So like we would have, an ongoing text message, every 2 weeks we would have a call with each other. It started after actually me kind of helping her while she was job searching. And then I think I kind of like was already teetering on the edge of, is this something I should do or not? So I think that's one of the best things is find a support group, and which is why I used to tell people all the time, like on our Career Contessa webinars or on the Career Contessa Instagram, like if you see someone who's also going through something with you, like that, those are it doesn't have to be a best friend. It just has to be someone who's maybe understands what you're going through. And people who are job searching in 2024 know what they're going through. There are tons of great relationships you can make through with people on LinkedIn when you like you're commenting on their stuff, they're commenting on yours, you're both job searching. Speaking of LinkedIn, I never announced it on LinkedIn that I was searching for a job. Mostly because I was still sort of unsure of what was all the details of Career Contessa, but I also wouldn't have been opposed to that. I think that's also a great strategy because you never know who also is and would have reached out and said like, oh, I'm also, and then you could say like, hey, let's keep each other accountable and help each other work through those tough moments. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, and one thing I've learned on this show is it always comes down to relationships, whether you like your job, whether you're job searching, like everything, networking. So I think I was, that's something I would say was absolutely important to keeping, not like turning into an emotional basket case, which I still did every once in a while. I'm human.
Yes, you need your emotional support buddy for sure. And I like that you called out that you would have posted on LinkedIn if you weren't running this brand, because I think people are shy or they just feel weird about it sometimes, but so many people want to help you that I think the more folks that know that you're job searching exactly how you did that warm outreach, the better, because you just don't know what opportunities are going to come up and you can be the first one that someone thinks of before the job is even posted, which is ideal when we're in such a competitive job market. In the interest of time, I want to move into some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Just because you did speak to interview prep in a really detailed way, and I know you talked about the power of networking, but I want to ask you, you touched on this a little bit when you spoke to the emotional side, maybe something that surprised you about the job search. It's been 10 years since you've done this. 2024 is really wild, as we all know, from a job perspective. Is there one thing that shocked you more than anything else?
I would say that like everything changed and also nothing changed at all. That's what I thought was kind of funny. I was like, wow, it's still, I hate to say this, but like sometimes you get lucky and you cold apply and someone reaches out to you, but there are other times where you do everything right and like the job you randomly apply for ends up calling you back, even though you've been networking so hard with the person who works at that company. Like so I think my surprise was just that relationships matter and that's never going to change no matter how amazing your resume is. And also there's so much emphasis given to like applicant tracking systems. And so again, I guess it's kind of a lackluster surprise, but in a way, if you can learn the nuts and bolts of how to job search and how to put together a strategy and how to utilize your network as part of that, you will know how to job search forever. That was sort of the like, again, like surprise and lack of surprise. You would think with all the tech and all the stuff we have today, but no, it comes down to sometimes, again, just like that growth mindset and trying new things.
I like how you keep talking about the job search almost as a skill that you can refine over time, and that all these things that you did are going to serve you in the future too, just in terms of the network that you built from all those informational interviews. I think there is a tendency to think about this is the only job search that matters. I'll never be doing this again. And the cool thing about when you're job searching is you're making connections for the future, but you're also getting better and learning along the way. So you're really just making your future career self that much stronger, regardless of what you do. So I think that's nice to keep in mind when you're a little burnt out too, that it's all not for nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. It might not be the thing that gets you the job, but it's not for nothing. That's why I was like, I know it's frustrating to hear that you can do everything right and the job doesn't come that way, but it's not for nothing.
Yeah, I love that. My last question is probably going to be the most challenging. I effectively want you to pick a favorite child and think through all the job search advice you've given at Career Contessa from the last 10 years. Is there one top tip that you stand by after everything you went through to find your new job that you would say, this is the most important thing, maybe barring relationships, because I feel like we've spoken to that quite a bit.
Let's see. I think being organized. I think, well, actually, let me take that back. Like, because I do think the job search dashboard allows you to have truly not be lackluster about this and like be organized and strategic. I think I've talked enough about that. But also for the interviews, I prepped for every interview like it was the biggest interview of my life. I prepped and practiced, and I remember the interviews, they were hard. They weren't like I definitely over prepared a little bit in a way. And one thing I would stand by is you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. So having really good questions to ask, being really interested in like what is the problem that they're bringing you on to solve. Um, I think that's really important. I'm really excited about my new job. I really like it. And part of why I think I really like it is because I spent so much time also interviewing them as much as they were interviewing me. And I prepped really, really well. So I was able to go into those interviews with an extra like kind of like pep in your step. And it's like going on a date and feeling really good about yourself. It's like the performance is better, right? Like you have a better date for you. And I know there's so many like metaphors to dating and job searching, and I will try not to like overdo it with that, but I only mention it because I felt like I really understood the role. I was really prepared, and I think that helped me come off as more confident and calm and connect with the interviewers a little bit better. But also, I felt like because of that, I was also able to ask them really good questions. And I think that that is a huge part of the interview that people always forget about. Yeah, you have your resume and you want the job and all that kind of stuff, but like what you're asking them and the conversation you are shaping by what you're bringing up because of your research can be a night and day difference between you and another candidate. I'm sure they interviewed candidates who had quote more like experience or like, on paper the experience, but and I was an entrepreneur. Not everybody wants to hire an entrepreneur to go in house. Like I feel like I was up against this challenge, and that was something that I thought was really like in hindsight. I'm like, I I absolutely understand what this role is about, and I feel like I was able to ask really good questions. I'd have to interview my new boss to actually totally understand her point of view, but I guess I'm sharing like I think the questions you ask are very, very important.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point too that you want them to be research backed because I think everyone knows you should have questions, but there's a lot of popular generic questions floating around TikTok. And I think it's really helpful to do something super specific to the person you're speaking to. And like you said, that all ties back to organization. So I think that's a great ending tip. I do feel like we could talk a lot more about this. So maybe there'll
I
have to be
know. Well,
more parts.
doable part two. Yeah, and actually, I'd be open to doing a part two. I'm very curious any questions that people have. So if you guys want, you can send your questions to me or Marnie. If you send them to me, send them on LinkedIn. I'm not really active on Instagram or the Career Contessa Instagram. And then Marnie, share your Instagram so they can reach out to you if they want.
Yeah, we'll throw it in the show notes. It's just my name, Marnie Lemonik, like lemon IK at the end. And I am
Um,
active on Instagram or
yeah,
LinkedIn.
I was gonna say she's definitely more active on Instagram. And also, one thing I would also emphasize just in this episode is like if you're struggling with the job search strategy, which is something I felt really good about because of what I was doing at Career Contessa, but we do have coaches, people like Marnie, who help you put together a game plan. And for me, I think one of the other things that surprised me is once I felt like I had kind of a plan, it was like I was really anxious about starting a job search. And then once I had a plan, then I was like, okay, I don't know how this is going to end. I don't have control over the timing, but I feel really good about the fact that I'm controlling the parts that I can control. And I think that's also important in a job search because it does feel like it's so out of your hands, but you can control making an amazing resume. You can control what your strategy is using that dashboard. So that's another thing. I'll put links to the job search dashboard that we have, the chat GPT prompts. These are all tools I use. I'll put also a link to our 24-hour resume makeover. I used the resume that's in there. It was actually kind of funny because I was like testing to make sure all of our stuff is still accurate and works, and I can prove that it does. And then also, you guys, I'll put a link to Marnie in there if you want to work with a career coach who can help you with a strategy. All of these things, I think if you are trying to make your job search less painful and, hopefully shorter, even in 2024, which yes, is a brutal job market, give yourself the best shot. Like, and that was, I think, something in hindsight, I wish I had maybe worked with a coach to have my resume. Like, it went a little longer than I needed it to, but I probably could have shortened that if I was willing to actually like get another pair of eyes on my resume and do that kind of stuff. I think sometimes it's hard for career coaches or people who are recruiters to then like get that help because they think they know. So that was like another thing, and like, probably could have saved myself some time. But okay, yeah, let us know if you guys want to do a part 2 of this. Hopefully this has been helpful and offered you some insight. And Marnie, thank you so much for being willing to be in the interviewer seat.
Of course, it was so fun. Thanks again for having me.